Humeirah is a woman trapped by the bonds of community and convention. Sabah Carrim's eponymous novel, set in Mauritius, follows Humeirah's quest for meaning and freedom. In doing so, it explores the role of philosophy, religion, and art in shaping and fulfilling individual desires and needs. Welcome to the World Literature Podcast. My name's Ivan Stacey, and on this channel we discuss literature from around the world, delving into the places, people, and ideas brought to life in fiction, drama, and poetry. In each episode, I invite an expert to give their views on a text or author, and today I'm joined by Sabah Carrim to discuss her novel, Humeirah. I hope our conversation inspires you to read it, and if you have anything to say about the novel or a conversation, please leave us a comment. And if you enjoy the content, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Sabah Carrim has published two novels, both set in Mauritius, Humeirah, which we are discussing today, and Semi-Apes. She's also published a number of poems and short stories, and in 2024 her short story Fading Mendy won the Afritondo Short Story Prize. She's currently a postdoctoral scholar at the Martin Springer Institute in northern Arizona. She's also co-host with Luis Gonzalez Aponte of Not to Forgive, But to Understand, a podcast series on genocide studies, and I've linked to that in the episode description. It's a pleasure to welcome Sabah to the World Literature Podcast. Sabah, thank you so much for joining me. Welcome to the World Literature Podcast, and it's great to have you on.
Thank you, Ivan. I'm very happy to be here.
So we're discussing your novel, Humeirah. Could you start just by telling us a little bit about the novel, why you think people might be interested in reading it?
Well, I wrote it many, many years ago, so it's been a while, but I would say that the topic has stayed very close to my heart, and it has evolved even into, and I found connections even in the scholarly work that I do today as an academic, as a professor. And well, Humeirah is, I see it very much as, fitting in with the trope that we find very commonly in literature, which is the story, for instance, of Catcher in the Rye. We also find the same trope in Le Grand Monde. These are all different references that I read while I was growing up. Basically, the trope of the misfit in society. And the trope of the misfit, comes up not just in, for instance, I just mentioned Le Grand Monde by Alain Fournier. This novel comes up, is relevant to, for instance, the thème de la jeunesse, which is basically the theme of youth, which I studied in French literature growing up. But also other works, such as other feminist works, such as Thérèse d'Esquerot by François Mauriac, where again you have the typical woman who feels claustrophobic in the environment that she's being brought up in. So Humeirah, pretty much for me, was that when I was writing it. And it was based very much on my own experiences growing up in that society. Humeirah is from, well, in terms of her background, she is Muslim, and she identifies as a Kutchi Memon, which is a very specific community of migrants from a part in India called Bhuj, which is in Kutch, the district of Kutch. And my grandparents, for instance, came to Mauritius in 1906 and 1916, respectively. So this is and they came with, of course, many other family members. So they form part of, they are made up of about, say, 1,000 members in the community in Mauritius. And also, I must say that just to get an idea of what we're talking about in terms of numbers, 17.3% of the population of Mauritius, which is about 1.4 million, 1.3 million people, is made up of Muslims. And within that Muslim group, you have this smaller denomination of Kutchi Memons, which is what Humeirah identifies with in the novel.
Thank you. You used the word claustrophobic in that description. That's very much what I got from it. Maybe we can just sort of expand on that a little bit. You began giving some useful context just in your answer then. Could you say a little bit more about how the culture of Mauritius shapes the novel and, this particular group that in the novel referred to as Memons? There seems to be a lot wrapped up, with that social identity in terms of religion, in terms of social class, in terms of particular expectations. So could you give our listeners a bit more information about that particular group?
Like many members of ethnocentric and endogamous societies, when I was growing up, I couldn't understand why there were these practices within the community. It was when I became a scholar, when I started reading, that I came across these words and it made sudden sense. And not only that, when I started traveling, and I've lived in 5 countries so far, I started to discover that every country has its own ethnocentric communities, and that made me feel a little better because it's terrible to think that we are from the worst of the worst societies who,
Mm,
hold kinds of practices. So on one hand, I started to also understand the virtues of ethnocentrism in the sense of it is a survival instinct. It's a way to preserve one's culture and identity. That has its own merits as well, because we speak about, celebrating diversity, celebrating different, cultural differences. We want to uphold that as much as we can. We also want to preserve these practices, and we're all about that, especially as curators, museum directors, as scholars. We speak about preserving these traditions and making sure that these are celebrated. On the other hand, the same ethnocentrism can also be damaging. It can be damaging to individualism. It can be damaging to the desire to be different or to be unique or to be questioning. And I think now with time, I have been able to understand the complexity of this, of what is involved in being brought up in an ethnocentric community. So there are certain safety valves within, as I said, in growing up in a
mm,
ethnocentric, but there are also disadvantages, which I think are very obvious to many and which are, I hope, well depicted in the novel.
mm,
So I just want to make sure that these terms are clear. Ethnocentric, um, ethnocentrism, for me is sort of a direct extension of egocentrism in a certain way, because we'd all like to think we're special and different,
mm,
and we try to do that in every possible way. And I think as a community, then if you extend it from the individual to the community, ethnocentrism manifests in the belief that the community we belong to is better than the others. And I
mm,
think it doesn't just apply to, cultural backgrounds, or it also, applies to, say, political allegiances. Oh, I'm
mm,
right wing, left wing. It also applies to religions. I'm Muslim, or I'm Hindu, or I'm Christian, and I'm better than the rest of you.
mhm,
So I think it manifests itself in different ways. And I think just understanding that these are human creations, these are societal creations, help me understand more, help me further my understanding about where I come from.
mm. And I think those are really interesting points. I think this desire to be special, you sort of see it everywhere. I think social media now is saturated with take this quiz. What personality type are you? What childhood trauma do you have? What's the best workout for you to lose 50 pounds of belly fat? It's all like you're so special. It's actually probably not, right? Um, it's, so I think those are some really interesting general points. Are there particular characteristics of Mauritius and the Memon community that you think make that ethnocentrism perhaps stronger or manifest in particular ways that you're exploring in Humeirah?
Well, I mean, I have a lot of thoughts on the subject, but I just want to quickly, speak about, how you read about these. Well, there's a lot in common with other ethnocentric communities. I mean, you're asking me about differences. I would say that everything I think of in terms of differences are actually things I can find in every other ethnocentric community
Mm,
that I. So it's difficult to speak about differences, but I would say there is a belief, for instance, that because the Maimans came to Mauritius and they came as traders, as opposed to indentured laborers from India,
mhm,
by the British India, East India Company. It was believed that these the Maimans are wealthier, than the other communities of India, and of course you had many of the families had, you know, helpers and drivers, in their homes, and this was very different from many other communities there. But as many of us have pointed out, sometimes these differences are very artificial and they are very political in the sense that, of course, you had more diversity than just these clear-cut boundaries between, say, the Maimans, and then you have the Surtis, and then you have supposedly the Kalkatias and all these other denominations of Indians within the community. There was there were fewer such boundaries when you look deeper into history, and I think you find these segregations to be very artificial every time you dig deeper. And that doesn't just apply to those times, but even now, every time we try to, for instance, even when it comes to the Rwandan, the genocide of the Tutsi, when you try to make the difference between the Tutsis and the Hutus, you're like, well, there aren't really any differences, and these differences are, constructed by the Belgian colonials of the time. So I think a lot of these assumptions made by the community about being, say, wealthier, therefore classier, therefore with better taste in clothes or apparels or decoration, home decoration and all. I think these are gross misconceptions. And I think what is amazing also, which I realized with time, is that the more you expand your world, you get to know other communities. Like you have I spoke about the Muslims here, but if you just want to say the Hindu community as well, you have people who come from, even different rural areas within Mauritius. And Mauritius is such a small place. It's a small island, but it's big enough to have so many pockets of people strewn everywhere that they, in their own little pockets, think they have their own narrative about where they come from. And there's always some added sort of story about how they were in a better situation, but things got worse, or that there was someone they were very proud of in the family just because of his or her education or his or her wealth. And so everyone has such a story, and it's beautiful to realize that even Mauritius, being such a small country, would harbor so many pockets of people thinking that they are better than other people, they're superior in a certain way. So I think this has been that realization, that understanding, which I gained far and near. I mean, while being in Mauritius, mingling with other communities, and also being away from Mauritius, going through research done about the country or meeting other Mauritians abroad, opened my eyes to this diversity and multiplicity within the island. So yes, I don't know if that answers your question, but there is so much to talk about, just like I said, just about ethnocentrism.
Yeah, it does. And I mean, in that part of your answer, you mentioned the fact, you mentioned Hinduism as well. In the novel, it's describing a Muslim culture, but we have various debates between characters regarding, say, different interpretations of how people should practice their religion. There also seems to be slightly deeper conflict in some of these debates between religion as a sort of set of social practices and then the more spiritual aspect as well. Do you think in the novel, are these two sides, these two aspects of religion necessarily in conflict? Do you think they can be brought together in some way?
I think it goes back to egocentrism again. I mean, even in our practice of religion, we want to think that we do it better than other people. And these clashes which you see, the gossip that goes on where people are criticizing each other and saying, look at what they do, they're mixing, they're spoiling the religion by introducing, these additions and all of that. I mean, it makes for good dialogue in a novel. But it also, I think, what was refreshing or comforting for me was to find out when the book went around and traveled, because, books travel. And when the book traveled and was read by different people from different backgrounds, I was really touched by the fact that Muslims from other backgrounds, I mean, not just Muslims, but people from different backgrounds, whether they were Christian or otherwise, or Hindu or Jewish or whoever or whatever, could relate to this gossip. And so I thought, well, the biggest compliment one can pay an author is to say, I can relate to your book, and this
Mm,
person would come from a completely different background. That speaks about the universality of that piece and that debate among people. So, um, you know, it's a bit like when you are trying to learn a new language, or if you want to master a few languages very quickly, you just need to know that there's 20 verbs you need to study, and there are 20, there are other pronouns, the personal pronouns that you need to know. You need to know a few adjectives, and
mm,
then you're good. I mean, you just need to be able to cover this core, these basics, and then you're good to be able to use that language effectively when you are in a new society. So I
mm,
think it's the same thing. Once you actually you live long enough in an environment, you start to grasp the universality
mm,
of the conversation that goes on there. And I think it makes very good material for a novel or
mm.
work that has to emulate some kind of universality.
Yeah, I think absolutely. And, I asked you for some of the context about the men on Community, but in some ways it's not needed because you see these structures of exchanges and the sort of types of characters we recognize who are bitching behind somebody's back or whatever. Yeah, it is, you do see these common patterns, I think. Absolutely. Um, Another, I suppose you've mentioned actually egocentrism a few times, very much the sense of the individual, but then also how this expands out to, a need for maybe belonging or a need for a belief in the superiority of one's own community. Between those two scales, we have the family as well. And in the novel, many of the difficulties that Humeirah faces are related to family. And there's this sort of desire actually to turn away from her family, which in some respects is very understandable. Her husband, Haida, is not a sympathetic character. Other aspects of her family life, notably her relationship with her daughter, seem to run quite counter to expected social and we could say affective norms as well. So, in the novel, is the family and the kind of expectations around it, is that a kind of trap? You talked about both the positive and negative aspects of community. Do we see that also with family, do you think?
Yes, I mean to say, I think many of us who are brought up in communitarian, heavily communitarian environments sometimes seek the opposite. The grass is greener, right?
Mm,
That's sort of exists in all of us. I don't think we should look at the debate, however, between individualism and communitarianism as being categorical or binary.
mm,
I think even when we seek this individualistic pursuit, when we have this individualistic pursuit, we end up, having a kind of community around us. As Nietzsche said, we have the
mm,
advantage of, when we have friends, we have the advantage of at least choosing them as opposed to, family members who are kind of forced onto us.
mm,
I think all of us, I mean, I know very few people in my life who are absolutely, you know, isolated. I actually don't know anybody who's absolutely isolated. If they are, probably that's the reason I don't know them. But
really?
but I'm just saying that I think we all want to adjust the level of communitarian belonging we wish to have. And I think sometimes it becomes stifling if that community we belong to does not give us the chance to have that freedom to be ourselves. And within the Maiman community, when I revised the novel a few years ago, because there
Mm,
was a revision, there was a second edition, I made sure that the focus was not entirely on Humeirah, because Humeirah is a member of the Kachim Maiman Society, yes, and she goes through her own struggles, yes. But there are many other Maiman members of the Maiman community who did not or do not have to go to the struggles that she went through. So within a community, I think recognizing diversity is also very important to do justice to the many individuals that form a community. And I think anything to do with homogenizing, stereotyping, providing monolithic accounts of what people are like if they belong to an entity is something I think scholarship, academia, my academic pursuits has opened my eyes to. And I think I feel today, if there is anything I support, whether it's in the work I do in fiction or in nonfiction in academia. It's to make sure that this nuance, variety, this diversity, this move away from stereotyping
Mm,
is constantly taken care of. And I think providing or making sure that people understand the diversity of people in the Miman community
mm,
uh, is properly exhibited, is properly manifested. It was one of my priorities in the last few years, which is why there was a revised edition.
okay. That's interesting to know. Thank you. The fact that these big labels, like I'm aware of individual and collective, having worked a lot of the time in Asia, and collectivist is a label that's applied to various Asian cultures, and that in itself, Asian is just such a huge label to put on people. And the West being individual, and the West, we have community, of course we do, and in Asia people have individual interests and desires. So I think, some deconstruction, one of the things it did is these dichotomies always sort of bleed into each other. And I think that's something actually we see in the novel, that the desire for collectivity has its sort of manifestation in individual behaviors, and, establishing oneself as an individual. One thing that Humeirah is looking for is, a community to share her interests and passions as well.
Yes, I don't think she wishes to be on her own, and I think many people
Mm,
don't understand that sometimes. Where when you're fighting about wanting more freedom, and you look up to, say, the West, and I'm again generalizing here, it's a big community,
mm,
but when you're looking up to the West, you're just people who are within your community look upon that cynically, and then tell you that you're being childish, and one day you'll come back and you'll return, you'll realize the virtues of being in the community that you're born in. And I think again that's uh, the oversimplification of the truth of the matter. Um, because I feel that you seek that what you really seek is not to be alone and isolated from people. You actually just seek to be in an environment where you're stimulated. And I think where you can have the chance to, question things which are taken for granted. And here I want to just bring up something which I found profound, where, very often we look upon misfits because we started by speaking about the trope of the misfit in a
mm,
society. We look upon the misfit as being, well, a misfit, pariah,
mm,
the recluse of the society. And so we think that this person probably doesn't belong to that society. On the contrary, one of the uh, pieces I read, which really touched me, was this discussion about continuities and discontinuities. So a discontinuity would be somebody who can't fit in, and you think that you must get rid of that discontinuity. But the discontinuity is there to be able to question some of the things that have come up in that collective, in that community, which
mm,
probably have become dogma and now need to be questioned so as to give life back, or give or reinvigorate that community.
mm,
So the typical example given in the book is, they say, the greater the clashes or the greater the tensions within the community, the product, the discontinuity would be stronger and more powerful. So then they speak about Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche,
mm,
the philosopher, and they speak about how he was a product. He was born in this environment where the dynamics were so powerful, and they were, clashing with each other in such with such immensity, that he was the direct product of that, and he came into to put into question a lot of things that had been taken for granted.
mm.
I look upon discontinuities in any society, whether you are a politician, a writer, an artist. I look upon these discontinuities as being essential for the life of that community, for the existence, the continuity of that community.
Thank you. Yeah, some really interesting points, and you just mentioned Nietzsche. We'll talk about some of the cultural influences that come through in the novel in the second part. So I think this is a good place to take a pause. Thank you very much for your answers. Thank you to viewers for listening to this part, and please do join us for part two, where we'll, as I said, discuss some of the cultural influences and go into more depth into the novel. Hope to see you there.